All right, so thanks again for doing this. My first question to you is tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you started in the mental health realm.
Yeah. So my name is Kaitlyn Valdez. I'm a licensed professional counselor in both Colorado and Minnesota. Um, I honestly don't even know how I fully got started into the mental health field, but I ended up switching from a journalism major to a psych major in college, and then decided I wanted to go to grad school. During grad school, I ended up finding that I loved learning about and working with people with like chronic illness, trauma. And then after that, after graduation, I ended up finding that like eating disorders had a huge, it coincided a lot with both chronic illness and trauma. So I kind of found myself falling into those three broad umbrellas. So yeah.
Hmm. As a journalism major myself, I can understand how people switch to different careers. So yeah. Um, of course, I am still currently a journalist because that's my role. But yeah. Um, anyway, my next question is, tell the audience a little bit about the work that you do. What do you do in your current practice?
Yeah, so I am currently switching completely over to my private practice. I do a mix of like in-person and telehealth. And it's a really broad question. Do you know how, like, is there anything you can ask to
Um,
like narrow it down?
like, like, sure. So, like, what's the work that you currently do? Like, do you work with kids? Do you work with adults? What sorts of populations do you work with? Because when I talk to people in this field, they work with a variety of populations, and yeah, they differ.
For sure. No, I work typically with adults. I do occasionally work with teens. So typically 14 and up, 14 or 15 and up. It really just depends on whether or not it's a good fit. But I also have clients who are in their 70s. So I work with like a broad range. I really enjoy the people who have been dealing with a lot of problems or things that have just been persistent. So usually they are decades long, whether it is illness, eating disorder, or trauma, or a mix of all three. So that usually brings a wide variety of people to me. But I love working with just about every age group except for kids. So
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, I get that. So my next question is, what sorts of methods or approaches do you use when working with patients? Because you work with a wide variety of patients. Do what? Because I've heard of like EMDR, uh, and other related practices and methods, but particular to your particular sort of practice, what sorts of methods or approaches do you use?
So I typically use really a mix of a lot of different things. Um, it does depend on like what you're coming for. So say for like a chronic illness, I do typically try to focus more on like mindfulness and acceptance and figuring out like what's going to work best for you. How can we accept the things you can't change, but also accept the things that you can? And that can be helpful. Sometimes CBT, so like cognitive behavioral therapy, can be helpful to like change some thoughts that maybe aren't working. I actually haven't found that to be as effective as like ACT, so acceptance and commitment therapy with like chronic illness or trauma, because a lot of that you can't really change. And so I do typically try to stick more towards like ACT for illness and trauma. But for like eating disorders, there's a lot of dialectical behavioral therapy. So like we really work on figuring out what level of stress can you really go through and like how well can you tolerate it, and let's build up that tolerance. And that usually does have more a mix of like experimentation, like let's try new coping tools, let's try things out, let's see if we can identify like thought patterns that aren't working or making it worse. And it really is like, and there's no one size fits all. So I don't like to use a single modality because odds are it may not work. And
Hmm.
so usually I like to get creative with all of my clients. So it kind of depends.
Yeah. Tell me, what impact does your work have on the greater community? In other words, doing this kind of work, what have you learned, in doing this kind of work, and what do you hope to sort of learn, like, long term in the future? I know this is a two-parter, but yeah.
I guess to answer the first question, like what have I learned? I learn something new every day. It is wild and I love it because I never know what kind of experience people are coming with. And usually that leads to a lot of interesting ideas, perspectives, things to just take in. I also really enjoy because I work with such a broad age group, ranging from like 14 or 15 all the way up to people in their 70s. There's so much to learn, like that generational knowledge. And so I do enjoy kind of sharing that across the age gap. My younger, my teens usually teach me about TikTok, which I don't really use that much. And then I teach all of my older clients, like, yeah, here's Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And so we kind of just distribute knowledge, and it's really fun to do that. Just like, yeah, this is what's kind of happening, and I get to be the in-between person. And I like being that person to connect with people who maybe don't always have that person. Because the downside of like all three of the groups I work with is they're really isolating and not everyone understands. So that, which kind of leads into that second question of like, I hope by continuing to work in this field, people start to understand that there's like, there's not a lot of us out there. I didn't realize when I came out of grad school that like working with eating disorders is really uncommon. And then even more so, working with chronic illness is even more uncommon. And so there's not as much research as I would hope to work with. So I don't have a lot of that to draw on. So it's a lot of just figuring out where can we find the tools that we need and how can we all kind of come together as a community to figure out like, okay, what works and what have other people experienced? How can we use that to create a bigger community that is better understood?
Mm-hmm.
I
My
don't know if
next,
that answered it.
yeah, yeah, it really did. My next question is, like, what have people who have come to you and uh, told you about their problems, what have your clients said about, like, how when they come in and say, I really learned from, from doing this, talking to this about you, what sorts of testimonials can you bring to sort of share, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, what common themes have you heard from your patients that say, oh, I learned about this or I learned about that, because you work with a variety of patients, like a broad swath of age groups. So yeah.
I think the biggest one is really just like a lot of my clients will tell me I never thought of it that way. And like, it's really nice to have someone who just, I'm not here to judge. I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. I'm just here to offer a different perspective. And a lot of my clients say that's something that can be really helpful because I'm also someone who gets in my head a lot, and so do a lot of my clients, and we all just kind of get stuck there. So I really try to help pull people out if I can. And sometimes it doesn't take too much. Other times it takes a little rerouting. But the biggest thing is like, oh, I never thought of it that way, or oh, I actually do have access to that. Like that's something I've been doing forever. We're just changing how we're looking at it or changing our perspective. And so that might be one of the biggest ones that most of my clients have told me through the years.
Mm-hmm. to kind of wrap this up, like what can people take away from this conversation? How can this type of work make a difference in people's lives? Because people, they have a lot of things and they're struggling with all sorts of issues. So, but what do you say? What can you say about that? What's your take on that?
Mhm. Would you be able to repeat the
Yeah,
question?
why is the aspect of mental health really important? Like for people, like in general, how is it sort of a sort of tool that they use to help solve their problems?
Okay. Yeah. I guess something to keep in mind is that like mental and physical health usually go together. They're not, mental health is just as important as physical health, and usually it shows up in one way or another. And especially when working with like eating disorders or trauma or chronic illness, your body is telling you so many different things. And a lot of us get really good at either ignoring what we're physically feeling or emotionally feeling. And it's important to give space to both. And it can happen at your pace. As long as it's like medically safe, it can happen at your pace. I'm very big in believing like you get to control, you get to decide and make choices. But mental health is just as important as physical, because at the end of the day, they're going to impact each other. Whether it's, oh, I feel like my heart is racing because I'm really nervous, or I'm sleeping way more than usual. So maybe I'm a little depressed, or maybe I'm also having a flare up and I'm depressed, whatever is happening. And so it's important to figure out ways to make life sometimes a little easier and just worth getting up in the morning, even if
Yeah,
it's just a cup of coffee.
yeah, sure. It's kind of that mental and physical health, they kind of overlap in a way. So yeah. To I know to just this last little bit of last little question for like the upcoming psychologists, mental health professionals who want to get in the field, what sorts of tools, tips, advice would you give them to people who want to enter the mental health profession?
Go in with an open mind. You may not end up where you want to, and that is absolutely okay. Learn what you can, take in whatever you can. Um, Try to experience as much as possible. I had a great time. I move around a lot. We're finally getting stable here, but learn from everything. I'm a huge reader as well. Like we love to, my husband and I love to travel. We love to read. He has very different reading interests too, but the amount of times where I've been able to like bring in his experience, whether it was like his experience in the military or my experience working with athletics or a random book, I have definitely made like fourth wing recommendations to clients. It really like learn from anything, learn from everything. There's so much wisdom out there, and it's
Yeah.
not just in the research journals.
Yeah, yeah, you and I are opposite because I used to read, but now I'm not reading anymore. But now I realize I have to read some more books. Yeah,
They're worth it.
yeah,
Like I get loads of book recommendations from my clients because most of them have figured out like, oh, you're a book nerd. And I so the amount of interesting recommendations I get usually are they're fun.
yeah, I bet they are. Lots of different kinds of books. All
Oh yeah.
right. Anyway, okay.